Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Human Stories, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. I woke before the sky admitted color and set a pot to boil, letting the kitchen fill with the thin hiss of steam. The November air in West Ashley slipped through the window seam like a sly cat, and I nudged the thermostat downward out of habit. On the counter waited a small turkey I'd bought with a store coupon, its skin pale as paper. I rubbed in sage and a little orange zest, persuading it toward celebration. Money had been tight enough to make every choice feel like math. My janitor hours covered rent, pills, and groceries if I stacked coupons the way my mother once stacked quilts. Still, the table deserved ceremony. I ironed a cotton runner and set out the good plate's blue-rimmed china with a chip near the rim of one saucer. When my son was small, he used to trace that rough spot with a finger and laugh as if the plate had a dimple. The living room had the tidy look of rooms that get cleaned at night. The carpet had gone threadbare along the path from sofa to kitchen. One spring inside the cushion sighed whenever I sat. I learned to perch lightly and rise without making it complain. I tied my hair back with a ribbon, smoothed the sleeves of a sweater that had shined thin at the elbows, and whispered a promise that I would replace it come January. By late morning, warmth moved off the oven in soft waves. The turkey began to smell like butter and garden in summertime. A pumpkin pie cooled by the window, the crust a little darker than the recipe's photo, but respectable. I crushed pecans in a freezer bag with the rolling pin and thought of my son Adrian, who had studied maps and numbers until they gave him a career in clean energy. He used to sit at the card table doing algebra while I clocked in for the night shift. Now he wore jackets that kept their shape and shoes that looked like decisions. The tires I'd been listening for finally eased to a stop. I opened the door before the second knock. Adrian came in with half a hug and a grin that lifted the whole room. The watch at his wrist caught the light like a small sun. Behind him stepped Lila in a pale wool coat, all elegance and perfume that reminded me of green apples. She kissed the air near my cheek and told me the house smelled wonderful. I helped with their coats and pretended not to notice the weight of wool and leather. We ate while the afternoon brightened and then softened again. Adrian talked about a coastal grid project and a contract that would bring wind power to smaller towns. Lila described a gallery tasting menu, 4 spoons of something that sounded like music. I passed the rolls. I refilled glasses. I laughed when laughter was asked for. Pride rose in me like a steady tide. After pie, I poured coffee. Adrian leaned back quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that gathers light. I watched steam curl from the cups and set the sugar within his reach. Adrian lifted the cup, blew across the surface, and set it down again without drinking. A faint line appeared between his brows, a look I remembered from the days when math problems refused to yield. He glanced at Lila, then back to me, a small, careful smile returning to his mouth as if placed there by hand. "Ma," he said, easy conversational, "how are you liking the cottage?" What I thought I had misheard the word caught inside the room's soft clatter of dishes. "The cottage on Sullivan's," he said. "The one I put in your name for your birthday, 2 summers ago." The fork slid from my fingers and struck the plate like a bell. Lila's smile tightened, then fractured. She dabbed at the corner of her mouth with a napkin that no longer needed dabbing. "Adrian," I said, the syllables thin as a seam, "I don't have a cottage." For a heartbeat, he only stared at me, and the kitchen seemed to tilt a degree off level. He leaned forward, elbows barely grazing the table, careful not to disturb the cups. "That can't be right," he said, but the confidence in his voice had already loosened. I had the deed transferred. There were gifts, monthly deposits. It wasn't a one-time thing. Lila rose suddenly, chair legs squealing against the worn floorboards. "Excuse me, I need to make a quick call." She moved toward the kitchen, the fast, anxious click of her heels like small hammers along tile. I kept my hands in my lap so he wouldn't see them shake. "Deposits?" I asked. $1,800 every month for 2 years, he said. His mouth tried to frown and hold calm at the same time. He did the arithmetic faster than breath, nearly 43,000. "You haven't been getting them." "No." The single word sounded larger than my throat. I thought of clipped coupons and half doses of pills, the sweater worn shiny at the elbow. A wave of foolishness washed over me, stupid, stubborn thrift performed in a house that should have been held by a different key. Lila's voice hushed and hurried, threaded in from the kitchen, too low to catch, but edged like thread pulled hard through fabric. Adrian pulled out his phone. His fingers were steady, his jaw not. "We'll sort it," he said, and the certainty steadied me enough to breathe. He tapped, scrolled, and placed the call on speaker. A woman answered almost at once. "Yes, Mr. Hale." "Renee," he said, "I need the file for the Sullivan's Island property, the deed transfer, the account we used for the monthly stipend. Pull it all." Keys clicked. A pause. Papers shuffled on the other end like soft weather. "I have it." The deed shows transfer to Eleanor Hale on November 14th, 2 years ago. For ongoing support, deposits were issued to the account you provided, routing number ending in 3274. We also mailed the recorded deed to the address on file, an apartment on King Street. That isn't my account, I said before I could measure how my voice would sound. And I've never lived on King. Lila's voice went silent in the kitchen. The quiet that followed had a texture. It pushed against the windows and made space feel heavy. Adrian's gaze cut toward the doorway. He didn't raise his voice. He did not need to. Renee, he said, who updated the banking information and the address. Your wife called to confirm the change, she said without hesitation. She said your mother had a new account and a new mailing address. I have the date stamped here with a follow-up email from her personal domain. The room's warmth inverted. The oven still radiated hospitality, but the air went sharp and thin. Lila appeared in the doorway, her hands folded together so tightly the knuckles blanched. Lila, Adrian said. His voice carried nothing decorative. Explain. She wet her lips. A smile flashed and died. I think this is a mix-up. Banks make mistakes all the time. Maybe they miskeyed the numbers. We can call tomorrow when they open and... A mix-up, he repeated softly as if trying on a word 2 sizes too small. For 2 years, with a deed and an address you confirmed with an account ending 3274. She shook her head quickly, hair catching light. I was trying to help. My parents... Her voice thinned to almost nothing. My father's lungs, the bills, help who? The question left me before I could dress it in softer linen. My hands were flat to the table, palms burning from how hard I pressed them down. Help who, Lila? Because I can tell you who wasn't helped. Her eyes found mine and then fled. We meant to pay it back. She sounded like someone standing on a dock yelling over wind, just until things stabilized. There is no we, Adrian said. His hands had become very still. There is my mother who worked nights and cut pills in half. There is me who trusted you with her comfort. And there is you who called my assistant and changed an address you knew wasn't hers. Lila took a step into the room, then stopped. She looked small without her coat, without the practiced drape of ease. The house was empty, she said the words desperate and quick. It sat there season after season. My parents were drowning. We only stayed to get through winter. It was supposed to be a bridge. I didn't think. You did, Adrian said. You thought at length. You made phone calls and opened accounts and redirected documents. You thought exactly enough. The coffee had cooled in the cups. The pie had lost its shine. I could feel the oven's heat still breathing at my back and the cold riding in from the window seam, 2 climates occupying one room. I stood the chair's legs complaining against the floor. Where I asked, and I kept my voice steady. Because it was the one thing I could keep steady is the money my son sent me. Where is the key that should have been mine? Her throat worked around an answer that never changed shape. Tears began thin tracks that gathered at her jaw. I moved funds into an account with your name. It was just to manage things more easily. It's not as if You used my name. I didn't mean to interrupt, but the words stood up and spoke for themselves. You used my name to turn locks I never touched. She reached toward Adrian as if he were the past and the future together. Please, she said, don't ruin us over this. I'll unwind it. I'll make calls. I can explain it. He pulled his hand back before hers arrived. With what? You haven't worked since we married. What you carry came from me. What you wore here came from me. And what you made my mother swallow came from her. Something in the room gave way, a soundless crack like a river thawing. Lila's posture folded. She sank against the chair she'd left and gripped the back as if it could be a life raft. The silence lengthened until it was bright with strain. I sat again, not because I wanted to, but because standing felt like a claim, and I needed to listen more than I needed to claim. Adrian reached for the phone once more. Renee, he said, send the full packet to my work email and forward a copy to legal. Include call logs, email headers, and all timestamps related to the address and account changes. I want the signed forms as PDFs. I want every thread. Yes, Mr. Hale. He ended the call. Lila pressed the napkin to her mouth. When she spoke, the words slipped through cotton. I didn't mean harm. I meant to protect my parents. You've seen the invoices. They had nothing. You were married to a man who would have helped Adorian Seward. Yea, each word placed with care. You did not ask. You moved through my trust like it was a hallway. I lifted my cup and discovered my hand had steadied. 2 years, I said. The number held its own weather. 2 years I lived smaller than I had to. 2 years you smiled in this room while I measured out heat. Lila's face crumpled. For a second the glamour fell away entirely, and she was a tired, frightened woman who had done something she couldn't fold back into its original shape. She took in breath like someone surfacing too fast. I'll fix it, she said, and the hope on the words made them more dangerous than despair. I'll call the bank now. I'll transfer everything back. The deed, You will not touch anything, Adrian said. Not accounts, not emails, not files. His gaze cut to me, then back to her. You will sit down. She sat. He rose, went to the counter, and shut off the oven, even though the turkey was already carved and the pies already cooling. The single click sounded final. He returned to the table and laid both hands on the wood as if it were a map. I saw the boy who used to draw rivers and roads with a dull pencil, trying to understand how places connected. Ma, he said without looking away from Lila. Did you ever sign anything? Anything at all? A deed, a new bank application, a tax return? No, I said. I thought of the way my wrist loops the E in Eleanor, how the letter looks like a curl of ribbon when I am not in a hurry. I sign rent checks and field trip slips when the neighbor leaves them with me. That's the sum of it. Lila swallowed. There was a power of attorney temporary only to file that. There was not, Adrian said. He did not shout. The words did the work on their own. The radiator ticked. Outside, a car passed the low Doppler of its engine, traveling from one window to the other, reminding me the world beyond our walls continued to move indifferent to any one household's oxygen. He pulled his laptop bag onto the chair beside him and unzipped it with care that sounded violent in the room's quiet. I'm going to need your driver's license, Ma, he said, still not raising his voice above ordinary. Social. Anything with your signature. He looked at Lila. And I'm going to need you to answer questions without embroidery. She nodded, tears returning in fresh lines. I stood again and went to the small drawer where I kept safe things, the library card, the lease, the documents that can't be replaced without phone trees. I set them on the table one by one as if they were stubborn birds that needed coaxing to land. Licensed Social Security card, the last year's return, a stack of envelopes with my looping hand across them. Adrian studied each piece the way a builder studies a lot before breaking ground. He took photos. He compared edges and heights of letters as if measuring lumber. Lila watched us. She looked like someone trapped in a story she had once authored and then lost the plot of. I'm sorry, she whispered, and the words floated for a second before falling without a place to land. Adrian did not answer. He opened his email and began typing. The clack of keys was clean and deliberate. The screen lit his face from below, carving planes I had not seen when he was 8 and all knees. I sat, palms flat again, steady now. The room had not changed, but its meaning had shifted a few inches to the left, altering the angles of everything inside it. 43,000, I said quietly, because saying the number anchored it. It stopped being mist and became furniture. And a house. Lila closed her eyes as if the lids could keep something from getting in. It's not what you think, she said. It was never greedy. It was, she groped for a word that could turn fact into nuance. None arrived. I looked at her and saw layers, the crisp coat by the door, the perfume like green apples, the easy compliments and practiced ease. I also saw her knees in my kitchen, her fingers white-knuckled around a napkin, the sudden smallness that comes when the scaffolding of certainty collapses. Adrian finished an email and sent it the little whoosh, sounding indecently cheerful. He closed the laptop and finally looked up, and his eyes were not the eyes of the boy who used to need me to double knot his laces. They were level, the kind of eyes that read contracts and topographies. We're done eating, he said, and his voice had returned to its ordinary softness. If you're cold, Ma, I can fix the draft on that window before we call it a night. I'm not cold, I said, though I could feel air stitching itself along the baseboard. The draft would be there tomorrow and the day after, but the room didn't belong to it. Not tonight. Lila rose and carefully stacked dishes that did not require stacking, as if the right alignment of china could return balance to the rest. She carried them to the sink and let the water run as if a faucet could drown silence. Adrian carried the coffee cups. I wiped the table with slow circles that left the wood cleaner and no less changed. When the kitchen was restored to its tidy version of itself, we moved back to the living room. The cushions sighed when I sat. The house resumed its small murmurs, refrigerator, compressor, a far dog, the wind knifing through the gap that always eluded caulk. Lila perched on the edge of the chair with her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for the principal. Adrian stood by the window and looked out as if he could find a different street simply by staring hard enough. No one spoke for a time that stretched. It wasn't the quiet of comfort. It was the quiet a room keeps when it has heard truth and is letting the walls expand to house it. Adrian turned from the glass at last, and there was a gentleness in his face that shouldn't have been possible but was. He walked to me and touched my shoulder. The touch wasn't apology and it wasn't promise. It was present tense. I nodded because speech seemed excessive. Lila's breath hitched across the room. The heater clicked on and pushed a wash of lukewarm air along the floor. The smell of sage and citrus still lived in the corners. Night gathered outside the windows, steady and unremarkable. Inside, the air thinned into a clarity that didn't need commentary. The plates were clean. The table was bare. The lie at last had nowhere left to sit. The house returned to its ordinary small noises. The radiators click, the refrigerators sigh. Yet the air felt rearranged as if a wall had been moved an inch without telling the studs. Adrian closed the laptop and slid it back into its sleeve with a care that made the gesture feel ceremonial. Lila sat with her hands locked together, the knuckles pale, the napkin on her lap creased into a stiff, useless flower. I gathered the cups to the sink and rinsed them, though they were already clean. The scent of sage and orange peel still lived in the corners. I slept in pieces. Each time I drifted off, numbers woke me 1,843,000 like streetlights passing across a ceiling in a car at night. Just before dawn, I gave up on sleep and put water on the stove. My elbows ached in the particular way they did after nights of scrubbing. The ache felt like proof of a life I had actually lived, and that steadied me more than tea. Adrian arrived at first light with a banker's envelope and a face that had not yet decided what to do with anger. He kissed my temple, set the envelope by the bread box, and asked for my license and social. Lila had not come with him. I did not ask where she was. The street outside sounded thin and new, the way it does when most people are still turned toward their pillows. "We'll need originals," Adrian said, gentler than the words themselves. "If you have anything you've signed, cards, old checks, bring those too." I brought a stack from the drawer where safe things live, my license in a sleeve gone cloudy with age, the social security card that still showed its careful creases. From the day the clerk had slid it to me, the lease, a few birthday cards in my looping hand. He photographed them on the table under the window, the morning light making rectangles of proof. I watched the screen reflect in his eyes and thought of the boy who had once copied letters with his tongue between his teeth, insisting the curves be proper. By 9, we were standing in the lobby of Seacoast First Bank, the kind of place built to make money seem simple. The floor was a polished stone that made our reflections look thinner. A woman at a desk greeted us by name after Adrian handed over his card. Her nameplate said M. Garza Client Services. Her blazer had a tiny pin shaped like an anchor. "How can I help?" she asked, with the tone of someone who had learned to deliver calm first and answer second. Adrian placed the banker's envelope on her desk. "We need to pull every record connected to an account opened 2 years ago under my mother's name," he said. "Eleanor Hale. There's been a misdirection, identity misuse." He stopped before the word theft, perhaps because saying it would make it heavier in the room. Ms. Garza's brows knit a fraction. She keyed in my information with practiced taps, then asked me to read out my social. Saying the numbers aloud felt like standing in a doorway in my slip, but I said them. She disappeared behind a frosted glass panel and returned with a folder the thickness of a paperback novel. "This account was opened in person," she said, sliding a photocopied application to us across the desk. 2 years and 3 weeks ago. Signature on file. Initial deposit $50. Subsequent deposits monthly $1,800 recurring. The paper looked like any other form until I saw the signature. Eleanor Hale in neat strokes, the E a narrow ladder rung. My hand, when it is itself, loops the E like a ribbon. This one looked taut in a way mine never did, as if whoever made it feared curves. "That isn't my signature," I said. The word surprised me by standing up straight. Ms. Garza nodded once. She had that particular bank voice that knows about people's disasters and doesn't prod them. "If it is not yours, we will treat this as identity fraud. I will need a copy of your license, social, and a specimen signature sign. Your name a few times here." She pushed a pad toward me. I wrote my name 3 times. The second looked most like me. She held the pad beside the application and squinted at the tails of the letters. "Different hands," she said, mostly to the file. "We'll flag this, freeze any remaining activity, and print the statement history." She turned to the computer, clicked printed. Pages gathered with the soft, relentless sound of facts arriving, whether you want them or not. She paper-clipped the stack and slid it to Adrian. "Total deposits over the period 52,000. Even," she said. "Withdrawals primarily ATM and debit small amounts over time. Mailing address, King Street, Unit 3. Phone number," she read off a number that ended in 27. I shook my head. "Not mine," I said. "I have had the same number since we could carry them in our pockets." She updated something on her screen. "We'll place a fraud alert with the bureaus," she said. "I'll also generate an affidavit for you to sign attesting this is not your account. You will need to file a police report. We can attach that once you have it." Adrian sat very still while she spoke like a man, trying to give his anger's legs somewhere to stand. He flipped through the printed statements with his engineer's eyes mapping the flow, ATM withdrawals in 5 different neighborhoods. Debit charges to a coastal hardware store. Grocery runs out on Sullivan's, a handful of transactions in a pharmacy chain that didn't exist on my side of town. He tapped a page with his forefinger. "See this?" he asked. "Recurring transfers labeled House Fund." He looked at Ms. Garza. "Can we pull the signature card surveillance stills from the day the account was opened? If the system retained them," she said, "we'll make the request." She turned the monitor so we could see a grayscale, still a woman at a counter, head bowed over paperwork. The image had the clarity of a dream half remembered. You could make out hair pulled back, a coat with a fur collar, the suggestion of a profile. You could not make out a face that would hold in court. My stomach registered the coat, first Lila's winter coat or one like it. I said nothing. So did Adrian. We signed the papers Ms. Garza gave us. She affixed sticky flags where signatures were required. Her anchor pin caught the light each time she leaned. "I'm very sorry you're dealing with this," she said, and the sentence sounded like a real one, not the kind they teach. "Take this copy. Keep the originals together. When you have the incident number from the report, call me directly." Outside, the day had the lucid brightness Charleston gets. After a cold front, the sky scrubbed clean. Adrian held the folder under his arm like a book you do not lend. We did not talk on the sidewalk. We did not need to. The wind off the river knifed between buildings and made my eyes water. I let it decide the reason. The lawyer's office was a second-floor suite above a florist, the kind of place where you can smell the decisions people have to make. Donovan and Mace was printed on the glass in tidy gold. The receptionist wore a cardigan the color of old roses and a look that had seen too many crying clients and kept tissues within reach. We did not cry. Mr. Donovan himself had the cautious politeness of a man who trusts paper more than people. He shook our hands with a grip that meant business and gestured us into leather chairs that made an expensive sound. His desk was neat but not empty. A yellow pad with ruled lines sat in the center like a stage. "Start at the beginning," he said. We did. Adrian explained the stipend, the deed, the assistant's call log. I set the bank folder on the desk and opened it like a storybook I did not want to read. Mr. Donovan listened without the interruptions that mean someone is waiting to talk. He took notes with a pen that made a sound like patience. When we finished, he spun the pad and reviewed what he'd written. "What you are describing includes several tracks," he said. "Fraud and forgery in the transfer of the property, identity theft in the opening of the bank account, possible wire fraud depending on how the stipend was directed, and if documents were filed with government agencies under a false address, additional exposure there. We will need to move carefully." He slid a document from a folder already on his desk, as if he'd anticipated our arrival by a day. "I pulled preliminary public filings when Adrian called," he said. "The deed on Sullivan's shows your name as grantee. The mailing address on record, however, is not your residence. The recorder's office mailed the stamped deed to King Street. I want samples of your signature to compare with the deed. We can have a handwriting expert look, but frankly, he placed the deed copy beside my birthday cards. The differences are visible with the naked eye. Your E is looped. This one is a printed spine." He opened another folder. "There are also 2 credit applications in your name that resulted in approvals," he said. "Limits not extravagant, $3,000 each, but enough to matter. Balances were run up and paid down irregularly. Mailing address again, King Street. There is a small personal loan as well, original principal $5,000 secured with your name, only no collateral beyond your signature." I stared at the typed line where my name lived next to obligations I had not invited. 2 years compressed into figures on paper, busy with transactions I had never held. Mr. Donovan's tone did not change, but I heard its edges. "The IRS sent notices last spring addressed to the King Street apartment," he said. "We obtained copies. They concern unreported income, your son's monthly stipend. From the government's perspective, it looks as though you had income and did not declare it. The address that received those notices was not yours." The room drifted a few degrees before righting itself. "Am I in trouble?" The question sounded like a child's. "You are the victim," he said. "The facts will prove that. But facts require assembly. We will document your signatures, your residence, the pattern of the account. We will obtain your son's email from his assistant confirming the address change request. We will preserve everything." Adrian's jaw flexed. "What's the number?" he asked, all told. Mr. Donovan ran his pen down a column. "Between diverted stipends, the loan charges on the cards, and exposure associated with the property transfer, we're looking at approximately $85,000 in direct loss, separate from any tax penalties will abate with proper filings." The number was an object now, not a mist. It sat on the desk with its own gravity. I placed my hand on the edge of the table because the floor had become too far away. Mr. Donovan folded his hands. "One more thing," he said. "Possession. Whoever is occupying the Sullivans' property will need to be removed if they are there without your permission. We can file immediate notices to vacate and deliver copies in person to prevent any claim they did not receive them." Adrian didn't look at me when he said, "We'll go." The drive to the island took us past marsh grass, winter brown and glittering. The causeway crossed water shining like metal. The sun stood low, sharp as a nail. Mr. Donovan followed in his car. We could see his sedan in the rear view, steady as a verdict. Adrian's hand sat light on the wheel, the way flight instructors teach pilots to hold a yoke. He did not play the radio. I held the folder against my knees. The edges cut through my skirt and left a line I would find later. Sullivan's Island has a particular quiet, the kind that sounds expensive. We turned down a lane hemmed by palmettos and sand my shoes weren't meant for. The cottage stood white with a long porch and tall windows that took the day into them. It looked exactly like shelter should look. It looked like a life with good bones. A silver SUV sat in the crushed shell drive. 2 children's bikes leaned against the rail, small as questions. As we walked up the steps, voices came from inside. Television laughter, the clatter of something set down in a kitchen. Adrian's jaw went hard enough to change the angle of his face. The door opened before we could knock. A man stood there, 50s, a neat gray beard, a sweater that had cost somebody too much, and went still when he saw us. Surprise rose and then went somewhere behind his eyes, replaced by calculation. "We've been expecting," he began. Then thought better of the sentence. "Adrian." "Mr. Wick Adrian," said his voice neither warm nor cruel. He looked past the man into the living room, where sunlight lay on a rug that had not seen my feet. "Where is my wife?" "In the kitchen," Mr. Whitcomb said. His hand made a small, helpless motion as if the word kitchen might disguise the situation as hospitality. "We thought you would call first." "We did," Adrian said. Down the hall, Lila appeared with a dish towel in her hand, as if the towel could launder the moment. Her face had the swollen look of someone who had wept, or been instructed to look as if she had. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater. Powder lived in the crease beside her nose where tears had carved a path. Without her coat, she looked younger and smaller. Without the frame of my house, she looked like someone else's daughter again. "Adrian," she said. The word was apology and plea and habit. Behind us, Mr. Donovan mounted the steps with the kind of measured pace that announces paperwork. He introduced himself with a card, then held up a manila envelope. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he asked Lila. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitcomb." He looked past Lila to where a woman hovered by a kitchen doorway, a dish in her hands as if she'd been caught holding someone else's heirloom. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped forward, chin lifting with the dignity of people who have always been told they are decent. "I'm her mother," she said. Mr. Donovan's expression did not change. "These are formal notices," he said. He handed one set to Lila, one to her parents. "The property is titled to Ms. Hale. You are occupying it without her consent. The notices give 30 days to vacate. Copies have been filed." Mrs. Wickham's mouth opened on a protest that tried to be upright. "We were told." "By whom?" Adrian asked, and the 2 words stripped paint. "By Lila," she said with a quick defensive glance at her daughter. "She said you wanted us to use the place. She said it was a gift out of kindness. We would never." "You have been using money in my mother's name to live in a house in my mother's name," Adrian said. He kept his voice quiet. Quiet held more. "You have been buying groceries and paint and hardware and 1,000 small household nothings with funds diverted from a woman who cut her blood pressure pills in half." Mr. Wickham lifted his palms, the human gesture for, "I mean no harm that people use too late." "We thought it was temporary," he said. "We thought we could manage. We didn't know the details." "You knew enough to keep keys," I said. My voice surprised me by sounding like my own. I had pictured this porch from the hallway of my small place as if it were a painting in a catalog, a life you could point at and say one day. Now wood lived under my palm. I could smell the ocean's iron. You knew enough to cover the windows and gauze curtains and set a jar of sea glass on the sill. You knew enough to let your grandchildren leave their bikes by the rail. Lila's eyes filled again, maybe because mine did not. "I can fix it," she said ragged. "I can transfer everything back today. We'll leave this week." "No," Adrian said. "No more movement, no more logins, no more calls. You will do exactly nothing." He looked at Mr. Donovan. "You have copies." Mr. Donovan nodded. "Filed and stamped," he said. He spoke into the air and the air listened. Mrs. Wickham's hands fluttered and settled. She looked around as if the house might chime in on her behalf. "We didn't come here to steal from you," she told me, and the "you" had a frantic sincerity in it that made something inside me give. "My husband's ailing. The winter was bad." Lila said, "I know what Lila said," I answered. I heard her say it to other people too. She said it enough that the story feels worn to the shape of truth. But the shape isn't truth. It's comfort. I looked past them into a kitchen done in a careful blue I would have chosen too. A pie plate on a rack. A row of mugs that matched. Evidence of a life made at ease on a foundation poured with my name. Mr. Wickham's shoulders sloped. He nodded once in the small way of a man who has learned when a moment outranks him. "We'll go," he said. "We'll gather our things and go." Mr. Donovan clarified what go meant in a language no one could misinterpret. He explained the timeline and the condition of the property at surrender, and what would happen if the timeline wandered. He handed over the second set of papers and asked for acknowledgement of receipt. Signatures trembled onto lines. Lila signed her name like someone tracing over a lesson she had not read closely. Her parents signed as if the pen weighed more than a pen. Adrian did not step inside. He stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets the way he used to stand outside a classroom door, waiting for me to come down the hall tall and stiff, and trying to make his body mean courtesy. I watched him and remembered all his doors. "We'll need the keys," Mr. Donovan said at last. He slipped a folded paper into the manila envelope, then looked at Lila. She fetched a ring from a bowl by the door, the kind of bowl I would have put by a door if the door were mine. She slid one key off and handed it to Mr. Donovan. She hesitated, then slid off another, a gate, a storage closet, and handed that too. She kept one on the ring for a second too long, the one that looks like a back door. Mr. Donovan waited. She removed it and opened her hand palm up. The keys made a sound like coins hitting a plate. Adrian did not take the keys. He did not need to. Mr. Donovan put them in a small envelope and wrote on the outside in block letters, "Sullivan's Primary Gate Back." He handed the envelope to me, not like a trophy, but like a responsibility you have always had, and are now simply touching again. The metal weighed more than it should have. I put the envelope in my bag and felt its corners press against the canvas. There is a point in any conversation where the words have done all the doing they can do. We reached that point and stayed there a moment longer out of habit. Mrs. Whitcomb murmured apologies with the dignified panic of a woman who had never expected to stand on a porch and apologize to a stranger whose name was on the deed. Mr. Whitcomb held the door as if courtesy could make him smaller. Lila watched my face to see if it held something she could still use. It did not. We left the porch and walked to the lane. The sound of the ocean carried over the roofs, calm, not indifferent, but not interested either. Mr. Donovan stopped at the sidewalk and looked back once the way a man looks at a job he knows he has completed properly. "I'll file the proof of service," he said. "Keep your phone close in case records come in that require your signature." Adrian nodded. He had not taken one step into the yard. He stood where the shells gave way to sand and breathed as though the air might be different if he did it right. On the drive back, the sky had shifted from bright to a flat pewter that made the marsh look like brushed velvet. Neither of us reached for the radio. The folder lay on my lap, heavy with photocopies, and the sour chemistry smell of toner. Traffic gathered, did its swarm, and let us through. At a red light, Adrian rolled his shoulders and said, "Do you want the heat up?" I told him I was fine. Sometimes fine is a truth, sometimes it's a lid. That day, it was both. At home, the rooms waited in their familiar rehearsal of themselves. The table stood clean, the cotton runner straight, the blue-rimmed plates back in the cabinet, with the chip facing the rear. The cushion released its long sigh when I sat. Adrian set the folder on the table and aligned its edges with the wood, in a way I recognized from fourth-grade homework, how he used to square his papers before he began, as if neatness could persuade numbers to behave. He opened to the page with the grayscale still of the woman at the bank window and turned it toward me again. We studied the suggestion of a coat collar, the bent head, the hair pulled back. "It looks like her," he said, not asking for confirmation and not needing it. "But we won't say it does. We'll say what we can prove." I poured tea because that is what my body knows to do when proof sits on the wood and asks to be housed. The kettle sang. The cup steamed. The house took in the steam and wore it in its corners. My name lived on papers in the middle of the table, stroked out by strangers, and by a daughter-in-law who had thought she could be careful enough to make a lie behave. Adrian rested his forearms on the table and let his hands lace together like a bridge. He looked older in the quiet, or maybe just more himself. "We'll keep the originals here for now," he said, and though the sentence looked toward a later hour, it did not make any promises. It simply noted where the papers would be when the house went to sleep. I nodded. We drank our tea without sugar. The wind found its seam along the window and threaded the room with a line of cold. I thought of the taste of salt on the air at the cottage and the slick feel of keys inside a small envelope and the exact sound a notice makes when you slide it from cardboard to hand. Night drew itself up outside with no fanfare. In the kitchen, the oven held the ghost of yesterday's meal. The house settled into its hinge noises. In the wood grain of the table, the lines ran sure and already written steady beneath the stacked pages. The folder on the table grew heavier with each new page Mr. Donovan sent us to print and initial. It wasn't the paper, it was the way facts acquire weight when they agree with one another. We kept the originals in a shoebox lined with a dish towel, as if softness could keep the corners from bruising. When the phone rang, it was often a clerk or an investigator voices that carried procedure the way trees carry wind. The officer at the precinct took the report with a neatness that made the form feel less like a wound and more like gauze. He asked for a summary in my words, then asked again for the same facts in a different order the way they do to make sure the truth holds from multiple angles. Adrian sat beside me, silent hands folded, his body a firm line. At the end, the officer slid a stamped sheet across the counter, an incident number, a date, a seal. I folded it and slid it into the shoebox. The lid closed with a small sound that reached the next room. Hearings arrived in a sequence that built a kind of calendar around our days. First, a civil motion to secure the cottage and authorize rekeying. Then, a criminal arraignment with a list of charges read into the air like names. The judge's voice had a timbre that made each word separate and complete. Lila stood at a lectern beside a public defender because the lawyer she favored for small frictions did not come to rooms like this. She wore a gray suit that made her look thinner. Her hair was pulled back without ornament, an arrangement that turned her face into a set of angles you could measure. When she spoke the word guilty, it came out in a register quieter than the Hivac, but the court reporter's fingers caught it. Evidence assembled itself like furniture delivered to a house, bulky, dull, undeniably present. The forged deed. The bank application with its narrow E, the grayscale still of a woman at a counter in a coat with a fur collar, statements that charted money through months like a slow winter river, Renee's voicemail log preserved as a transcript with timestamps and a mundane precision that made my skin cold. 10:42 a.m., caller identified as Lila Whitcomb confirming updated routing number ending 3274. Mr. Donovan laid the pages in order as if setting a table. The prosecutor handled them with the respect you give objects that will not argue with you. When it was my turn to speak, the prosecutor asked me to state my name for the record, then asked for small, ordinary details address length of residence, employment. Facts that describe a life without telling it. They asked if the signature on the deed was mine. I said no. They asked if the account at Seacoast First belonged to me. No. They asked if I had ever lived on King Street. No again. The questions grew narrower until only a line remained, and I stepped across it. The 2 years of deposits diverted the couple living in the cottage, the way the notice sounded when it slid from envelope to hand. Lila stood very straight and looked over my head as if there might be a kinder ceiling in the room. When they asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she said my name and then stopped the syllables stranded between desire and permission. The judge watched her with an attention that had nothing to do with affection. "Ma'am," he said not unkindly. "Speak plainly." "I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed," she said, and the courtroom held the words without softening them. I was wrong. The judge spoke of trust the way a surveyor speaks of property lines measured exact. He read the counts and paired them with numbers. Months. Restitution. Supervision. There was no drama in it, which made the sound of his voice feel more consequential. 20 months in state custody. Restitution ordered in the amount of $85,000 to be paid according to a schedule the court would enforce. Prohibition against opening accounts in another's name. Notices to be sent to agencies whose systems had been given my address without my knowledge. The gavel was not a symbol. It was wood on wood. Outside the courthouse, the cold had found new ambition. Adrian exhaled and watched his breath plume. He looked like a man startled to see his own certainty made visible in air. He touched my shoulder the way you steady a table before setting down a glass. The keys to the cottage lay in the small envelope inside my bag, and the knock of metal against the canvas had become a private metronome. We drove to Sullivan's under a sky stretched tight and pale. Mr. Donovan met us there with a locksmith whose van held drawers labeled with numbers instead of words. He changed the cylinders with the efficiency of a ritual and handed me 2 new keys on a ring, each with a tag stamped primary. He drilled the back door plate and replaced the screws with longer ones that bit deeper into wood. The sound echoed inside the empty rooms. Empty was not quite accurate. The Whitcombs had left the surfaces clean and the closets open, but the house still wore their outlined faint shadows where frames had hung a drawer that stuck because it had been overstuffed once, too often a smudge on a baseboard at child height. I stood in the kitchen and put my palm to the counter as if greeting an animal you're not sure will come to you. Adrian carried in a grocery bag with coffee sugar, a loaf of bread, and a jar of marmalade that glowed like a small sunrise. The first night I slept there, the ocean's sound arrived through the screens in a long, even hush. I lay in a bed made with clean sheets that smelled of new detergent and salt air coming through the sash. The room did not know me yet, but it did not resist. In the morning, the light traveled across the floorboards and squares. I boiled water, spooned coffee into the filter, and discovered the way the kitchen windows framed the line where sea meets sky. I ate toast leaning against the counter. Marmalade ran onto my knuckle and shone there. The cottage needed the sort of attention that is more companionship than repair. The bathroom mirror had a silvered edge that the climate had worried. I hung a cloth to keep the glass from fogging and learned which window to crack to invite a cross breeze. The pantry shelves were set a fraction off level. I wedged a coin under one bracket and watched it right itself. I painted the kitchen a soft yellow that reminded me of a dress my mother once wore. To church, a color even winter can't ignore. I planted rosemary in a clay pot by the steps and spoke to it as if it were an old friend reluctant to thrive. Adrian brought over a set of tools with blue handles and a drill that was heavier than it looked. He fixed the sticking drawer and the hinge that whined when you asked it to work. He stayed to eat the simple soup I made with onions and the leftover turkey frozen in neat packets. He told me about a survey boat that had drifted off course about a junior engineer who had solved a stubborn piece of math with an idea so clean it felt like luck. He did not talk about Lila unless I asked, and I did not ask often. When he left at night, he stood for a moment on the porch and listened to the ocean the way you listen to someone you love when they breathe in sleep. Letters arrived from the state with their own sort of quiet finality. Notice of incarceration schedule for restitution guidelines for victim service coordination. There were envelopes from agencies I had never had reason to meet. Tax credit and office with a name so long the acronym was a shrug. We set up a file stand on the Cottage desk and sorted papers by what they asked and what they gave. Mr. Donovan's office handled the heaviest part, sending certified copies to the places that require them phoning a clerk, whose hours seemed to defy clocks. I signed where yellow flags told me to sign and made copies of the copies. A letter came from Lila, handwritten in a neat schoolgirl hand that suddenly revealed itself as practice rather than nature. She wrote my name at the top and then filled 3 pages with explanations that were not quite explanations, and apologies that leaned hard on the word sorry without deciding what it meant. I slid the letter into the shoebox with the rest and closed the lid. Later I moved it to the back of the box, where the felted corners made a small cradle nobody else would notice. The keys inside the bag at my feet were the only answer I needed that week. The neighborhood learned my name at the speed neighborhoods do. The woman 2 doors down brought over a tin of cookies and asked with the bright carefulness of the curious if I was the new owner who wasn't new. The man across the lane helped carry a rocking chair from my son's truck and told me which days the trash actually got picked up, despite what the flyer claimed. Children rode by on bikes and stared without malice the way children keep their bafflement visible. I waved and learned the language of nods over hedges. Restitution didn't arrive with the flourish people imagine. It came as checks that looked like any other checks, creased and stamped and necessary. We deposited them without ceremony. I used the first to settle the pharmacy's stack of receipts I had kept neatly in a chip clip. The next paid down the balance on a card in my name that I had opened 10 years prior and never let stand above a month. When the larger sum posted, I walked into the motel where I had scrubbed floors and told the manager I would not be renewing my casual schedule for winter. He shook my hand with a gentleness that made my throat go tight in a way I would never describe. The Cottage took me in more each week. Photographs went up, not many, just enough to prove that we were a family who occupied light. One of Adrian at 8, gap-toothed and furious at a kite string. One of my late husband with an unguarded grin, the kind you don't know is rare until it becomes so. I set the chipped blue-rimmed plates in a glass front cabinet and turned the nick to the back, then changed my mind and turned it forward. Imperfections behave better in daylight. On quiet afternoons, I sat on the screened porch with a cup of tea and watched the gulls angle along the wind. The water changed color as the hour moved pewter, then slate, then a kind of bruised blue that made the sand look paler. A boy threw a ball to a dog that wanted nothing else from the day. The rosemary sent small prompts of resin into the air when sun warmed it. Inside the house held its temperature without complaint. Adrian visited on weekends and some weeknights if the bridge going home was kind. He fixed the weather strip on the back door, then took it off and did it again because the first was good enough and he wanted better than good enough. We ate at the small table under the window and left the dishes for a time as if they were a still life. I learned to sleep with the ocean's constant speech, to let it thread through dreams without waking me. On mornings when the tide was low, I walked the wet sand and found shells with their interiors still pearled. I didn't take every one. I took the ones that felt like they had waited for me particularly. News of the case traveled through town in the speedy sideways way news does. At the grocery store, a stranger touched my elbow and told me she had heard and was glad. Another woman looked at me a beat too long and then looked away as if wealth had brushed against me in a hallway. I kept moving. The Cottage didn't ask me to be anyone I wasn't. It asked only that I check the windows when storms were forecast and shake sand from the mat before it multiplied. One evening, Adrian brought fresh bread from a bakery that believed bread should be a kind of hope. We broke it by hand and ate it with butter while the sky thought about rain. He picked up the letter opener from the desk and weighed it in his palm, then set it down and leaned forward with his wrists on his knees, the posture of boys and men when they want to say something true and simple. She took 2 years, he said. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The room already held the rest. We sat with the exactness of it and let it be exact. Later, when he had gone and the house had swallowed his footsteps, I walked from room to room with the steadiness of someone counting. The kitchen with its new paint quiet as a held breath. The living room light soft on the wood. The bedroom where the keys lived in the bowl by the door, now not in an envelope, and made their small metal confession when I lifted them. I turned off each lamp and left the porch light on to keep the path sure. The ocean worked at the edge of the world with its patient industry. The cottage listened. Inside, the air held warmth, and the windows held sentences of wind without letting them in. The bed waited with its white coverlet smoothed. I slid between sheets cool from the room and listened until the hush of water found its even measure and matched my own. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.